We'll get started momentarily. Good morning and welcome to WITA's webinar platform. I am Ken Levinson, WITA's Executive Director, and we are delighted to have you here with us today. After 2+ years of only having online events, this week we went back to some select in-person events, but don't worry, we'll still try to stream our live content when we meet in person, and we'll continue hosting timely online events for our viewers in the US and around the world. If you've attended any of our 123 webinar panels in the past 2+ years, you know that we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with on today's Zoom, even if you can't see them on screen. So welcome today to Eric Bratberg with Albright Stonebridge Group, Amanda Blunt with General Motors, Fred Fisher with the Institute of Scrap Recycling Industries, David Talbot at Eli Lilly, and Carol Anderson at Microsoft. Welcome, Eric, Amanda, Fred, David, and Carol, and welcome to all of you. If you are watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom. We'll try to get to as many of those towards the latter part of our session as possible. You should have also received a copy of today's event program and biographies of our speakers by email, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. Today's program would have been timely no matter what, with the US-EU Trade and Technology Council meeting next week in Paris. But it takes on added importance with Russia's unprovoked invasion of Ukraine and a newly reinvigorated transatlantic relationship. Today's speakers each bring a unique perspective on the importance of the transatlantic relationship and cooperation, and we're delighted to welcome them here today. Eva Madel, member of the European Parliament from Bulgaria, who was introduced to us by my good friend Sarah Stewart of the Silverado Policy Accelerator and a member of WITA's Board of Directors. Another WITA board member, Lisa Schroeder, introduced us to Tony Fernandez, Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Trade Policy and Negotiations at the U.S. Department of State. Jordan Haas, Director of Trade Policy and Government Relations at Intel, who's been a longtime WITA member and works with our good friend Bruce Andrews. Tyson Barker, Head of the Technology and Global Affairs Program at the German Council on Foreign Relations. Tyson comes to us at the recommendation of Stacey Ettinger, who works with us at the Transatlantic Business Council. And of course, our moderator, former Congressman Bart Gordon, the U.S. Director of the Transatlantic Business Council, also known as the TABC. Welcome, Ava, Tony, Jordan, Tyson, and Bart.
Thank you, Ken, and hello to all of our listeners and watchers. As Ken pointed out, this is a very timely conversation at a very important time. So I find that these conversations go quickly, so we're going to jump right in. Tony, you are all packed up, ready to go to France. Wish we could go with you. So you're also the closest to the process right now. So tell us, what are you expecting out of this second meeting? And really, quite frankly, what has to be done for it to be a success?
Sure. Thank you so much for allowing me to join this panel today. Yes, now I'm excited about traveling today to Paris. It's great to virtually speak with all of you to discuss the TTC. I think you all know that the US-EU trade and investment relationship is based on a foundation of shared values of democratic governance, market-based competition, the rule of law, and respect for human rights, including the freedom of association and collective bargaining. For us at the State Department and at the United States, we're deeply committed to this relationship, and we must work with our allies and partners to address global challenges and opportunities. We know about a lot of those challenges that are out there right now, and our task with the TTC is really multifold. We're putting together and carrying out a compelling vision for global trade and technology in a way that serves our respective peoples. This means that we must protect and promote our innovations and democratic values, including the respect for human rights. I think the recent events definitely demonstrate that issue. The examples and standards we are set are vital to protecting the interests of our businesses and and citizens. And without them, actors like the PRC in Russia, who do not share our values or follow international economic norms, will create new norms that would be bad for both the EU and the United States. So that's why reinvigorating this cooperation is really important. From my perspective, the DTC really promotes an affirmative agenda on global technology, economic and trade issues, and it's really a key framework which has laid, in my opinion, the foundation for our renewed close cooperation and rapid results. The relationships we have developed through the TTC have really facilitated quick action and transatlantic solutions to global crises. I've been working in this job for several years, and frankly, before the TTC, we had few and difficult relations with my EU counterparts. But over the past 6 months, I speak to my EU colleagues maybe 2 to 3 times a week, if not more, and we've really been able to build a relationship of us getting to know each other despite the pandemic, and also building trust with each other. And so, I'll give you a few instances. These connections have really strengthened, on the issue of export controls. That working group has enabled us to work swiftly with our European partners to impose what I would consider the toughest export control actions in history on Putin and his supporters. This is especially focused on Russia's military capacity. This is something that we're all very concerned about. The TTC has also facilitated, I think, a deeper understanding and joint action on clean and sustainable energy and supply chains. We're cooperating to ensure our financial incentives for the manufacturing and development of semiconductors are mutually supportive and avoid a subsidy race to the bottom. I'm one of the co-chairs of Working Group 3, and this is a very important issue that we've been able to talk quite a bit with our European colleagues and reach, I think, some positive movement forward. We also believe that market forces are best able to address sustainability and to ensure a just and equitable energy transition. For instance, we're working on facilitating transparency in solar supply chains, which will help us take steps to eliminate forced labor from this critical supply chain. We both agree how important that is. Stronger research and development cooperation in rare earth extraction, processing, and recycling will increase the security and the supply of rare earth magnets, crucial to our energy transition and climate goals. This work will encourage the expansion and diversity of supply, vital to the health and resilient supply chains. These bridges will only get stronger as the TTC progresses. It's only been 6 months, and I think we've done a lot, and we'll have a lot to announce progress in some key areas on Monday. I expect only more success in the future. And at the beginning, I said I'm excited to be here and happy to answer questions on the TTC.
Thank you, Tony. Certainly, this is a new day in the transatlantic relationship, partly and unfortunately because of Ukraine, but I think it makes both economies recognize how we need to work together. So you say there's going to be some announcements, which I assume means you're not going to make any announcements right now. But can we assume then that there's going to be some so-called low-hanging fruit and some good guidelines that are going to come out of this first meeting, or not the first meeting, but the second meeting?
I wouldn't say low-hanging fruit. I would say, like as I mentioned, we've had a lot of discussions with our EU colleagues, and we've been hammering out a number of different areas. And so I think you're going to see some positive movement going forward. And we hope that this is really a continuous framework. As you know, and I encourage certainly your members, TTC does not work if we don't have buy-in from the stakeholders, from those in the private sector who believe in this and believe help us push forward on success for our stakeholders. That's the purpose of all this.
So we're going to stay tuned for some good news. Eva, you're on a very important committee in the European Parliament, the industry research, the energy research and energy industry Research and Energy Committee. How about
Yeah,
that?
that's a lot of topics we cover.
Covers a lot of territory. That's why it's an important committee. We all know that there's going to be a formal agreement. Both Parliament and the United States Congress is going to have to approve that. During the, and I don't want to make this anyway TTIP 2, but going back to the TTIP period, some felt that there wasn't enough conversation between the Commission and the Parliament. And so telling, how do you see that interaction now? And probably more importantly, what does the Parliament need to see coming out of this meeting? And what do you expect at the end of the day that you then can vote for?
Yeah, thanks first of all for having me on this discussion today. I've spent the past week in the US to kind of try to understand a little bit, what is the other side of the Atlantic thinking on TTC, on the CHIPS Act, on the AI Act, and so on and so forth. So maybe before I answer your question, just very briefly, I would like to make a point about the importance of solving those issues with our transatlantic partners, but also more importantly, with our democratic allies. As you said, I sit in this committee that covers a broad amount of topics. And I have probably been one of those people working quite in depth on most of the tech files that came out of Brussels over the past couple of months and the past couple of years. So I think I fully can grasp the big challenges in front of us. And some of those challenges are common both for the EU and the US. And one of these main challenges for me, actually two of these main challenges that I think are relevant to today's discussion is one, the use of technology by autocratic regimes and their attempt to set global standards. And now we also, of course, witness the dependencies on raw materials that can easily hinder our tech progress and tech competitiveness. And of course, there's many others, but I think in light of the coming negotiations on TTC and these discussions, these are two of the important challenges in front of us. And I think if we today do not understand that these consequences of continuous underestimation of an autocrat, even when it comes to tech, I think we need to start thinking, Europe cannot be naive anymore, basically. We need to start thinking in this sort of paradigm similar to the Cold War, the democratic world against the autocrats. And we need to have a common approach. And this is why platforms like the TTC are so very important. And we could actually already see some deliverables, especially when it comes to sanctions. I think we were so effective thanks to the good collaboration that the teams were having. I mean, as Tony said, that's exactly what I've heard from my European colleagues and commissioners. All of a sudden, people knew who are the people working on these issues. They had their phone numbers and emails, and they knew what they think about certain topics. And before that, they didn't even know each other. They never talked to each other. It was more of this high-level conversation at certain meetings, and then you maybe follow up on some topics, but there was no concrete shape. So as a parliamentarian, I definitely welcome that, because I think we need to have common approaches on two aspects. First, when it comes to the sort of rules we want to put out there, and particularly when it comes to tech, but also when it comes to the sanctions, for example. And then we need to understand we need to cut on dependencies that we have, because I think the global power struggle will become more sharper in the months and years to come, and tech will be the ground of that struggle. So having a clear emphasis on the TTC in some of the working groups that are very focused on things like supply chains or AI, I think it's really important, because if we don't, as partners, understand that we could only together secure secure access to critical components, I think our technological advantage could be definitely threatened by those authoritarian countries. So I think we can't create an independent supply chain, of course, on our own. And this is why it's so important to be able to coordinate together. And particularly, just a little bit more to elaborate on your question, I could tell you what I precisely proposed. So, we have a good collaboration with the Commission. I've met the two of, so to say, there are two lead commissioners, but there's a little bit more other commissioners involved. So maybe two out of the three main people from Commission side just last week before coming here. I think it's important for Parliament to be able to also bring in political pressure. But more importantly, I think there has to be some sort of a forum, an area where, and this is certainly probably what people like Tony and his colleagues don't want to hear. We don't want to be part of the process, but we want to be able to, make sure that the process moves fast enough and in the right direction. So if currently the working groups are all horizontal, I think sometimes those working groups have to be given certain priorities, immediate priorities, medium-term priorities, or long-term priorities. Then this priorities might shift and change in few months. But I think certain importance have to be given to some topics more than others because of the geopolitical situation we find ourselves today. And another thing is that I think, talking between Parliament and Congress can just, we can speak more open. We can, move certain and advance certain topics faster. And we are not part of the negotiations team, but I think we could be very useful in the process. So what I suggested is that the European Parliament kind of creates this subcommittee under the delegation to the US for MEPs that are interested to discuss on the TTC and kind of find the same sort of group in the Congress. So I've held a number of talks to kind of raise awareness on that in Congress, and I think there's many more MEPs at this point interested in the TTC than people in the Congress. So it will be really nice if, also through this discussion, there's a little bit of a push of this parliamentary dialogue in a way, because I think it should not be seen by, the teams working in the working groups as we are trying to meddle or anything. I think, I come out just, with a very, honest, so to say, approach. I just want to move some of those topics a little bit faster. And I want to see concrete projects also as part of the TTC. I think it's a good start. Can we do more? Probably, but let's see what comes as communication on Monday.
There we go. Ava, I like your enthusiasm. And I'm seeing that on both sides, that parliamentarians and just people involved want to see that transatlantic conversation get started again. And I think that really one of the benefits of the TTC is the platform can be more ambitious than just the 10 buckets. It's going to allow that conversation. I was on the US-EU parliamentary dialogue when I was a member of Congress. And I think that's an excellent suggestion as to getting those involved and getting that agenda going. Now, Tyson, you are a young guy, but you've seen a lot over these last few years with a foot both in Europe as well as in the US. And again, I'm not trying to make this, I don't want to jinx the TTC by saying it's a TTIP 2, but when we look at that, we found that, it was a difficult economic time like we're having right now. And so there's a limit to some of the ambitions because of, kickback from either the stakeholders or from citizens on either side thinking they might be taken advantage of by an agreement. So tell us, what is your political view of how ambitious can this agreement be?
Well, thanks so much for the invitation, Bart, and it's really good to have this conversation. First of all, I wouldn't even talk about the TTC as an agreement, and that's one of the big differences between the TTC and TTIP. This is a process, And I think that we are both aware, especially in the United States, but also to some degree in corners of Europe, that it's not necessarily the moment for classical free trade agreements. There just isn't the political sentiment in the United States, but also in Europe to support that in the transatlantic space. And frankly, I don't know if free trade agreements are fit for purpose for what we want to do, because this Euro-Atlantic economic relationship is much more built around services and digitization. And some of those areas are regulated by regulation, by technical standards, by cooperations between technical bodies, and a classic, zeroing out of tariffs and discussion of agriculture policy, while extremely important, might just be, tweaking around the margins when the real issues are somewhere else. Let me first say something about the Biden administration. I think that they deserve a great deal of credit for centering the US-EU relationship as a systemic partnership. And the TTC is really the heart of that systemic partnership. That is something that neither Democratic nor Republican administrations in recent history have done. And that elevation and that political capital that has been invested has allowed for this process to really flourish. Of course, it's also been impacted by events, but what we've seen in Russia's war on Ukraine is this TTC is yielding dividends. That investment is paying off. And the example, just to get a little technical, the implementation of the foreign direct product rule on the entire country of Russia, basically coordinating that with European partners to avoid, secondary externalities, would have taken weeks, maybe 6 weeks, and perhaps a lot of hurt feelings. And they were able to do that within a matter of days because of processes that were in place because of the TTC. There are a ton of good potential deliverables that can come out of this. But I will say, because you asked where the political what's politically feasible, I will say there are a couple of hitches. One is, even though there is a lot of convergence, regulatory convergence on both sides of the Atlantic, on data protection, on market power of online platforms, on content moderation, on AI, on digital taxation, on technical standards, convergence is not crossing the line. It's not creating harmony. And one of the reasons is because the processes work so differently. And I'm going to be quite frank, if you look at the passage of the DSA and DMA, which came in ahead of schedule or right on time, that's a completely different process than the one we have with Congress. And because of that, it's much more difficult to think about legislative cooperation because Congress is not as active in kind of creating that space. So the administration is somewhat limited in what it can do. And that brings me to my second point, where there's some political potential hiccups, is the political agreement, which is a great story, around the data protection framework, the post-privacy shield agreement. That is welcome on both sides of the Atlantic. But for critics of it in civil society and elsewhere in Europe, they say, this is great, but it's not being codified in law. And if it's not codified in law, it can be swept away by a different administration. So that is going to be a potential sticking point in the future. And the last thing I would flag as a potential political something to be aware of is the question of transparency and stakeholder buy-in. Not only, and that's something that it has in common, perhaps, with TTIP. There was a narrative that grew and metastasized in Europe that TTIP was being negotiated behind closed doors without stakeholder participation, including parliamentary participation. And that narrative helped to tank it in public opinion in certain key countries, including Germany. If the same thing were to happen to the TTC, it could be quite damaging to the process. So the shapers of this process need to be aware in advance, because there are countries, authoritarian countries, with very sophisticated disinformation operations who would be willing to take advantage of a narrative that says that TTC is intransparent. So those are a couple of potential traps political traps I want to flag at the outset.
Jordan, I'm going to jump back to Tony just a moment here. Tyson raised the very good thought that TTC is more than some grand agreement. And Ava also talked about how more conversations are being had. And Tony, as you know, the administration does not have TPA now, the Trade Promotional Authority. I was talking to two members yesterday of the Ways and Means Committee who thought that would come about, in the coming weeks, but it's difficult to do that in an election year. So what are some of the things, distinguish between a formal trade agreement that is approved by Congress and the Parliament and administrative sort of commission to the administration that can be worked out? What are some of those sorts of examples?
Sure. No, thank you for that question. I would say, as Tyson's also mentioned, this is by design, that it's not going to require congressional approval in order to move forward on these topics. It's not a formal trade agreement. The idea is that we're trying to seek areas of consensus and align efforts. But I would say that regarding the sustainability of this kind of effort, that's why you really need the stakeholders to buy in. As you're familiar and has already been mentioned, when you don't have stakeholders buy in, then you can't negotiate and you can't reach agreements that are politically acceptable to the folks both in the United States and in Europe. And so it's really those stakeholders, you all and your organizations and others, the private sector, that are going to hold us governments accountable and give it the TTC permanency. Without that, I think you're correct. It's unlikely to be successful.
Jordan, I was reading the other day that Intel is making a major investment in Europe, 80 billion euros, 100 million. I mean, 100 billion dollars, with from research to fab, the whole works, which goes back to Ava had mentioned supply chain earlier. So tell us a little bit more about this. Is this your effort to have a European centric supply chain and a U.S. supply chain, or will there be a trusted interaction? How is that going to work? Particularly, supply chain, I guess, in general, but everybody knows that computer chips is where it starts right now. So give us your thoughts, please.
Yeah, thank you, Congressman, for that. And I think you sort of take that step back. You can't open a paper today without hearing about a semiconductor shortage. Everywhere you turn, it's the buzz in town. It's the buzz all over the world right now. And the reality is the only way to solve the semiconductor shortage is to invest in new fabs, invest in new manufacturing, and be able to come online. Let me take a quick step back before we talk about Intel and we talk about the semiconductor industry between the US and the EU. US and the EU represent about 21% of the world's semiconductor capacity currently, and about 30% of the world's semiconductor demand for chips. So you already see a shortage right there. And in 2020, you saw a total two-way semiconductor trade between the EU and the US totaling about $4.8 billion. That shows that there is a strong relationship between the two. Now, Intel right now has announced big investments. We have announced and just completed about $3 billion investment expansion project in our Oregon facilities. We've announced about $23.5 billion in Arizona and New Mexico expansion. And as was announced at the White House a few months back, about a $20 billion investment in Ohio, or the potential of a $20 billion investment in Ohio if we get the CHIPS funding. And then at the same time, we've invested, it's about 36 billion we've announced in the EU, and that's between semiconductor R&D and manufacturing. And what we've done is we've spread it out around the EU also. So the big investment is in Germany with about a 17 billion euro plan to invest in first of its kind semiconductor both construction, manufacturing, and then looking at expanding in France, we've been in Ireland for decades, expanding our Ireland facility, about a 12 billion euro investment in Ireland. Possibility of expanding in Italy, expanding in Poland, where we have a large presence and lab space. And what you're seeing is with this, Intel is committed to the transatlantic relationship. As one company, we are looking at meeting this shortfall right now. But I think it's also worth noting that it takes 2 to 4 years once you start building a fab till you start getting those semiconductors off the line. So this is not a problem that's going to be solved tomorrow. But I think what TTC presents an opportunity is to align our systems so that we can align around technology standards, we can align around AI, we can align around supply chain, and the one component of that, we can align around research and environment, all those things that make the ecosystem for semiconductors, to make it as seamless for the global manufacturing population as possible. So I think TTC presents the opportunity. Intel, we are doing our part, but we are just one company within it. And it's probably worth noting that both the EU and the US are moving CHIPS Act. The EU's is moving a little bit quicker. And we assume that and have heard that the TTC presents an opportunity to even align some of the CHIPS Act and an understanding between the two sides of the Atlantic around that.
So, Jordan, how, I guess, representative do you think you are of industry in general in terms of this supply chain? All right, I was asking earlier, do you see a European specific supply chain, a North America specific supply chain? What will be the interaction there, and what are what do you need from TTC to make that work?
Yeah, no, I think that's a good question. I think it's a little bit of both. So what you're seeing an investment in the US to meet the US demand. You're seeing an investment in the EU to meet the EU demand, but it's under one company and one organization. So best practices in R&D development in one spot could end up going and being produced elsewhere, as well as, so from the TTC, where the benefits come in is alignment around technology standards, alignment around AI, alignment around basic rulemaking, alignment around environmental standards. All of that needs to happen for there to be an integrated supply chain between the US and the EU, even with under one umbrella of one company. And we are just one company within this. We're an American company. We're proud to be an American company, but we are just one company within the larger ecosystem of semiconductors these days.
Tony, I'm going to go back to you. Critical materials, rare earth minerals have been mentioned a couple of times. Interestingly, I guess it was almost 15 years ago, I had the first hearings in Congress, sort of the alert of what was going on there. I haven't seen a lot change since that time. And as a practical matter, if you're looking at rare earth minerals and critical minerals, they're outside of, for the most part, outside of the US and Europe. So you are the co-chair of the subcommittee that's going to take care of all that. So tell us how you're going to do it.
Well, this is really, really important. So, in that subcommittee that I'm working group that I'm the co-chair, we've already talked about semiconductors, clean energy, and these critical minerals and pharmaceuticals are the four main sectors that we're very much trying to deal with on disruptions and frankly vulnerabilities as you've noted. And so I would say that the first thing that the TTC helped us do among the US and EU is really identify these vulnerabilities, that we could talk to each other together with feedback from the private sector about what do we need to do as far as mapping and better understanding where we are on these key sectors. And so I would say that over the last 6 months, on rare earth magnets, other critical minerals. We have really both agreed on what things we need to be focused on, and I think going forward we're going to have consensus, and really, as Jordan has mentioned several times, alignment on how to respond to it. I would say that 6 months previous to that, or this time last year, that wasn't the case. And as you noted, this has been a historic problem. It's not a new thing, but I don't think previously there was an alignment that both the US and EU, we should tackle these things jointly, not go our separate ways, and looking at these how we deal with critical minerals. And so I would say, obviously I would also note that Russia's reinvasion of Ukraine, where minerals and other items that are needed, for example, for semiconductors, that also has heightened our both awareness and understanding of these vulnerabilities that both sides of the Atlantic have. And so I think that first we both agree that we need to work together on this. We're aligned on that, and I think that we're going to tackle these things together, which is something new and different from before.
Tyson, supply chain again has been mentioned a variety of times. You're in the U.S. enough to know that Buy America has raised its head again, which upsets the Europeans, and then sometimes they could retaliate is not the right term, but rather try to have similar type of goals. So, my hope would be that we have a trusted supply chain that is beyond the shores. What is your view as to likelihood of that, or is it just working together around the edges, or is it going to be a true transatlantic supply chain?
Well, I mean, I think that the TTC is trying to address this in some ways, and has started with baby steps and is moving up the ladder. And I think that that's a good sign, because there's confidence being built in how to develop supply chains, how to identify weaknesses and vulnerabilities. And then going beyond that, as a lot of this, let's be honest, this kind of technology industrial policy comes online in the form of these CHIPS Acts, for example, that they're open for transatlantic consortia in R&D and in production. And Intel is a great example, because there is a recognition that there isn't the kind of cutting edge capacity in Europe that might be necessary. And Intel is investing heavily here in Magdeburg, very close to where I live here in Berlin, and creating the kind of ecosystems that will foster an innovation industrial base for Europe in semiconductors, which it used to have, but has either become very niche or dried up. And the same needs to happen on the other side of the Atlantic. The way to avoid the kind of Buy American issue is what I think that the TTC is discussing, which is to put your cards on the table, to say, we're looking to finance these kinds of subsidies in these kinds of areas. And we want to make sure that what we're trying to do on both sides of the Atlantic is complementary rather than duplicative, so that you can avoid that kind of subsidy war. And I think that is something that both sides are becoming much more interested in as the ambition starts to grow. But, somebody mentioned, I think it was Tony, that Ukraine has just really shown us the vulnerabilities in even semiconductor supply chains. And I wanted to give a concrete example. Europe is 50% dependent on neon, which is a key component for semiconductor production, which is a byproduct of steel manufacturing from those very steel mills in Mariupol that are currently under siege. So even this very, very acute battle that we're seeing fought in Mariupol right now is affecting semiconductor supply chains. And that is how delicate the semiconductor supply chain is. Other supply chains are equally delicate, and they're being impacted by these kind of geopolitical earthquake, essentially.
Ken, I want to give Ava a chance to jump back in, but before we do that, are there questions from the audience? Anybody, do you want to sum anything up for us?
We have only a couple of questions have come in so far, Bart. So why don't you guys keep talking just a couple more minutes and then we can try to get those. But if you are online and on Zoom, please submit your questions using the Q&A and we'll try to turn to those in a couple of minutes.
So, Ava, you have been patiently listening to all the pontification going on here. Why don't you give us a European view?
Yeah, sure. Maybe just a little bit to build on the cooperation in the TTC and also on the supply chain issue. I mean, maybe what I forgot to mention, I mean, the way I see the TTC is basically giving the chance for both nations, so to say, to really think strategically. We have some existing strengths. We have some vulnerability gaps. If we do not use this platform to kind of find ways for synergies, because it would really be a big waste if when it comes to the CHIPS Act or when it comes to some of the legislation that Europe's thinking on, for example, on the AI Act, and I know the US is not, but I also don't want Europe to be this isolated island that creates this golden rules, then companies have difficulties to follow, no other nation wants to follow, and then we are kind of like exposed to those autocratic regimes that I talked about that are going to be more competitive, that are going to use technologies for malicious use and so on and so forth. So I would like to see, just much more cooperation and investing in some sort of joint projects. And this is why I think the TTC could deliver on that. It could deliver on standards. It could deliver on some, more clear rules or frameworks, but it could also have projects in the area of R&D and skills, of course, when it comes to supply chain monitoring. And I think this has been understood and there is a lot of work already put into that part, but also when it comes to cybersecurity and trade. I think the framework of cooperation has to kind of see what our mutual interests are. And the working groups kind of already show that. So it's time to put pen to paper and then make sure there's concrete action. On some of these critical materials, I mean, it's about, I think, more than 70% of materials that we need for the semiconductor supply chain. They're based in China. They're based in Taiwan, in South Korea, in Japan. And yes, we are leaders when it comes to R&D, to the design, to the software, to the intellectual property, machinery, equipment, and maybe other things. But we need to be able to leverage those assets on the global stage and to be able to diversify and strengthen our own supply chain. So I think there's greater strengths. Weaknesses are apparent. That's the lack of foundries. But we also need to ask ourselves whether this big ticket purchase of foundries is going to solve all our problems. It takes, as we've heard, billions of euros or dollars. It takes a lot of time to build one manufacturing capacity, and one manufacturing capacity is not going to solve Europe's problem, and neither it will get us to our aim, because the aim of the CHIPS Act in Europe is that by 2030, we are going to double the production in Europe. So it's important to have that in mind. And it's important, of course, to be able to have foundries and to put the money on the table. But that's not the whole ball game. So I think we need to make sure we make decisions that are able to strengthen our free markets, but also create a business-friendly environment that can help attract investments from around the world, because the endless public money and investments cannot be basically the only crutch that we are going to lean on, so to say. So that's why, for me, those acts should not work in parallel. There has to be a synergy around it, and one needs to sit on the table. And I think Tyson said, put the cards on the table. We need to be clear. It shouldn't be Europe wants to create Europe wants to design the most cutting edge semiconductors, and nobody else should do it, or we're going to build only those factories and we're going to be the first. It's not about this sort of competition. It's of course important to have it, but right now I think we just need to see it as this sort of topics. We need to look from a paradigm perspective, where back dating, as I said in the beginning, from the Cold War, it's the democratic allies against the autocrats. So if we want to succeed, we really need to be very open and transparent with one another and craft some sort of plans together. You could call it a roadmap, you could call it, I don't know what, but it has to go beyond just the immediate supply chain issue. Those plans that we are working on the CHIPS Act in particular, they're long-term plans and they have long-term goals. So there has to be a lot of alignment between the EU and the US.
Hey, well, we're going to go back to Ken in just a moment. I think what you outlined was an early warning system. It was frustrating to me to see Congress and the Parliament dealing with the same issue with basically the same purpose, but might get started in different ways. So hopefully this will be an early warning system so that whether it's rules, regulations, or laws, we know what each is doing and can work together. So Ken, you have some questions.
Yeah, our little prompt a minute ago gave us about a half dozen, actually no, 8 or 9 that came in just the last 5 minutes. So that's great. I did want to follow up. One question that was asked was about kind of the intersection of all this with Buy America. And maybe Jordan, I see you nodding. Did you want to jump in on that one?
And yeah, no, I think when you look at, I'm happy to sort of take a take at it. When you look at Buy America, the goal is to increase American industry, to expand American workers' jobs, and the building of these mega fabs accomplishes that. When you look at, or at least moves towards accomplishing that, every Intel job that's created at one of these fabs creates or supports an additional 13 jobs in the ecosystem around it, whether that's new companies coming and working alongside it, whether it's those that work in the construction, but it's 13 jobs. So the 4 new fabs, the 2 in Arizona and the 2 in Ohio that we've announced, will be about 78,000 new permanent jobs, and that's a creation. So when you expand that actually shows that there is going to be an expansion of sort of the goal of Buy America through these investments. And the same is true with what we're doing in the EU. But the whole goal of this is to align the two. And I think another point that's sort of not been brought up that the TTC has the potential to align on, and then we've seen some progress post the response to Russia's aggression on Ukraine, is the coordination around export controls. When you look at what's actually being exported between the EU and the US, it's important that the two systems are aligned and that you're not having one system because of glitches or how it's structured supporting exports while the other system doesn't allow exports within a certain area. So the TTC presents an opportunity, and I think a goal of the TTC is to better align our export control systems between the US and the EU to ensure that the transatlantic relationship is not competing with each other, that there is speaking with one voice and being able to deal business-wise as one voice. So I think that's another thing that we sort of haven't talked about, but is a key outcome. I think it gets to the supply chain, but sort of the broader of how we deal with the movement of semiconductor production, both within and then once it's completed.
Maybe we could say buy transatlantic in a secure way to grow the pie for all.
I think that's a goal. I love that, Congressman.
Okay, Ken.
Well, I think there's a new term that's been going around, near shoring in supply chains, and that's certainly even though maybe the Atlantic isn't crossing the Atlantic isn't
It's
near,
across the
is
pond, though, right?
it's crossing the pond, and it's certainly an ally. And related, there's one functionality question, Tony, I want to direct your way, and maybe Ava, just really quickly. Somebody was asking about the export controls issue, and how is it that interested third parties, NGOs, et cetera, get involved in these working groups and transparency issues, and what's the method for interested entities to join the working groups or be monitors?
Sure. Hi, this is Tony. So, well, first on export controls, that is a great example of what we've been able to accomplish on so far in the TTC as a result of Russia's invasion. We definitely chose strategically to limit Russia's military and military industrial complex while minimizing the impact on the Russian people. And so those export controls should be cutting off dozens of Russian defense companies from critical technologies, and hopefully will have a deep and lasting effect on Russia's defense industrial base. I'll just note from my personal experience, I'm a diplomat, and so my last assignment was actually in Moscow, and but I was declared persona non grata by Vladimir Putin in 2018. So I had to leave the country quickly, but I consider that a badge of honor. We were trying to do positive things in Russia and try to turn things around, and unfortunately Vladimir Putin wasn't interested. Regarding the stakeholder involvement, so we're very open to stakeholder involvement, and so there's been all of the working groups, the 10 working groups have had a number of different stakeholder engagements. I think that the easiest way is to contact, for example, people can contact me, the State Department. We're involved in all of the working groups. And so if there are folks from WITA who would like to get more information, we're happy to talk to them about how on the US side to get involved. We've both had joint stakeholder events with on both sides of the pond, as they say, and also one specific to industry folks and NGOs and others in each other's respective areas of operation. So happy to talk more about that afterwards.
Thanks. And Ava, any thoughts on transparency and the ways that European companies and organizations can intersect? And also, while we're at, and then so pivot, and then one other question that's just come up recently as well is sort of the intersection, not of private third parties interested in transparency, but how is the whole endeavor? What is the intersection with third countries and regions such as India and even China?
Yeah, great. Thank you, Ken. I mean, on the first question, I think Tony kind of covered it pretty well. And I mean, for me, as I said, I think Tyson brought that point forward first on the necessity of transparency of these negotiations. I think sometimes you might be as transparent as one could be. I think that was not perhaps necessary, the TTIP case, even though I was not involved and didn't follow it that closely. But we have seen, a number of, misinformation or disinformation campaigns or information disorder, you might want to call them, that once they start and try to put a topic and brand the topic as not being transparent and being negotiated by closed doors, it's very easy to do so. Just the other day I was in the White House and someone mentioned, we're waiting to hear from our colleagues from the commission because they're waiting to hear the input back from the member states. In Europe, there's no such thing that something's negotiated behind closed doors by one or two people. The machinery is pretty big, but I think is also very effective in trying to collect all sorts of opinions and then trying to make sense of them. But of course, that's a very difficult process to explain to the European citizens. So it's just very easy to say that was negotiated in a way, or that was discussed in a way that no one that no one knew how that was done. So anyway, and that resonates much better with citizens and public. But on the other question, on the relationship with say, third countries? I mean, so first of all, I think the TTC should be the place where both Europe and the US look at China in a strategic way. I know the US is doing that. And I know that when many of you come to Brussels and talk about some of the pressing issues of today and of tomorrow, China's not really mentioned, so to say, in some of the discussion, especially when it comes to tech. So for me, you know, what we are doing actually within the TTC and other, you know, opportunities that we have presented on certain agreements that we strike with Japan, for example, from an EU perspective, they all have to be seen as the democratic allies coming together to, you know, make sure we're more competitive, make sure that our national security is protected and our citizens' rights. And if we leave India somewhere, you know, out there being influenced, for example, now by certain information disorder, as well as, you know, other sort of influences, that would be a shame. And I think it should not just be the EU and the US. This circle of democratic allies has to be expanded in a very short period of time. And I know the US is very active in that arena, but it will be very useful if we expand the focus together with these other countries and nations. So I pledge for that very much. It's been part of my discussions, and I think the TTC again could be a good stepping stone to enlarge some of those conversations in a broader space. And I think that should be done in the medium term, and we should not wait a couple of years and be naive as we've been until now in Europe on a number of issues.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you, Eva. No, absolutely. I think there's a lot of interest in moving forward quickly. Tyson, I know you, I think you wanted to jump in on the India issue, and there was a question that came in on investment screening that you were.
Sure. Just very briefly on China, the Commission has to walk a very delicate line because the positions on China in the EU are very different. So what it has done, and I think that this is the right move, is to say that they are for specific values and rules and not anti-China in the TTC. And that's a framework that I think all of Europe can work with and live with. On India, there's a growing awareness that India is a systemic tech player in and of itself. It's a very different player with data localization issues, but its own industrial policy, also on chips, et cetera. And I think it's important to note that Commission President von der Leyen was just in India and announced another TTC, the second TTC, which will be an EU-India TTC. It will be a different animal, but that just gives you a sense of where they're trying to go with that relationship. Also, Modi was just here in Berlin, and I believe we'll be invited to the G7, so hopefully that will have some trade and tech aspects as well. On investment screening, Europe has passed an FDI screening regulation, but it is still done primarily by the member states. Not all member states have FDI laws, but what the cooperation between the US and EU has really worked, and I can say this sitting here in Germany, is that the CFIUS folks have been really willing to help build capacity and training for these nascent tech investment screening regimes that are coming into place. Even Germany, it had an investment screening law, but the enforcement and the scope has increased dramatically, so that even the Ministry of Defense here has, I think, hired something like 10 to 15 new people just to handle investment screening. That's the Ministry of Defense in Germany. So this is an area that's growing, and I think we'll see more work together in this in the future.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Tyson, for that. And I'm going to throw it out. I'm going to try to lump three questions together. We're kind of out of time, but I want to try to pull them all together. Tony, hopefully you can jump in on a couple of these. Are very big picture things. One is about the tension that exists between the EU commitment to some sort, a lot of regulations of big tech, fighting and interest in fighting disinformation and propaganda, but also on the other hand, the necessity of ensuring dissidents in places like Russia have a platform to speak out. So that's one issue that came up. Another one is joint US-EU work on food security issues. Guess there's some announcements that were in Bloomberg today about the need to work together because of the war in Ukraine has limited global access to some staple crops and fertilizers from the regions, including because of the sanctions on Russia and Belarus. And then lastly, any nexus in the work of the TTC and climate change efforts on both sides of the Atlantic. I know there's a lot. Disinformation, food security, climate change. Who wants to? Tony, maybe if you can jump in first, and then see who else wants to.
Yeah, let me jump in. So food security is an area that at the State Department my team leads on, and so I would say probably 50% of my time is spent on food security issues, and so let me talk to that. So next week at the UN, Secretary Blinken will lead basically a global week of call to actions on food security. So we're hosting a ministerial with a number of countries and also UN international organizations to talk about what we can do on to deal with the short-term and the longer-term issues of food insecurity and how that is having a lot of negative repercussions, particularly due to the Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And on the misinformation side of things, this is an area where both Russia, India, and China are spreading lies, frankly, about how agriculture is being negatively affected by sanctions. There are no sanctions on agricultural products, but there's a number of unintended, I think, intended consequences of Russia's invasion, where two big bread baskets that many countries in the world depend on. So the Secretary of State will be in New York. That's going to be on Wednesday for that U.S. That ministerial at the UN, and then on the next day there'll be a Security Council meeting to talk also about this issue of global food insecurity and what's going on. So I would say that the U.S. is trying to do a lot to rally the international community. The Biden administration has pledged more than $2.6 billion to help support a number of different folks around the globe with international organizations and others, whether the World Food Program. So I'm spending more time on food security than the TTC right now, even though I'm going to go to the TTC in a few hours in Paris. So we're trying to do as much as we can. And I would note, since Tyson's in Germany, the Germany is hosting the head of the G7. So there's a lot we're doing together with the Germans to highlight and also look to get donors to add to the pot to help folks suffering. Over.
Thanks. Anyone else want to weigh in on any of those big topic issues that I just brought up about food security, climate change, and fighting disinformation? Tyson?
Yeah, maybe two sentences on disinformation. So Europe just passed this Digital Services Act, which hasn't come into force yet, but it's going to really change the content moderation and platform governance landscape. And the US has reacted, obviously, with, it's not going to follow it exactly, but that path, but it's open for some constructive convergence. And I think in the TTC, there are discussions about greater transparency and data access for academics, greater regulation of how data is being used by social media platforms for minors, and also on disinformation, how the two sides can work together in crises like we're seeing right now when state-backed disinformation campaigns start to spread and metastasize. I think that both sides have a wake-up call that, Zelensky has been the great global influencer and has really won the hearts and minds in the global north. But that's not necessarily the narrative that's spreading in the global south, that Russia is spreading a narrative and China is kind of giving it some top cover. And that's something that needs to be addressed as well.
Thanks, Tyson. Good words of wisdom for all of us. I just posted a link in the chat that hopefully all our audience can see. WITA has been supporting World Central Kitchen's relief efforts in Ukraine, trying to do our part, Tony, to fight the food security issues as best we can with a wonderful organization based out of DC with Jose Andreas and his great work on the ground in Ukraine, but also fighting hunger and disaster relief around the world. So hope folks will join us in supporting World Central Kitchen. Thank you all for joining us today. I am sorry if we didn't get to every single topic. There was a lot to cover here. Really appreciate your time. Tony, I know there's probably a follow-up session to do after the TTC, but I think we were able to cover a lot on hopes and expectations and wishes and desires for the TTC and things that we hope to see going forward. So thank you all very much for your time. Thank you, Bart, for your help in organizing today's event. Tony, Jordan, Tyson, and Ava, thank you all so much for being here. Safe travels to all of you who are on the move over the next few days, and to everyone who is anywhere watching us. Be safe and take care, and we hope to see you again on the WITA platform soon.